It's my pleasure to introduce Carl Graham from École Polytechnique, who's our second speaker today, and he'll be telling us about self-adaptive congestion control.
Well, I thank the organizers of this beautiful conference for having invited me. So this is joint work with Philippe Robert and for some advanced studies on invariant laws with Mike Everlop of CWI. So the issue is modeling the internet, which is a wide issue since the internet is a vast, complex, and ill-known structure which is in perpetual evolution. So in which indisciplined users access it for varied purposes and have vastly different characteristics and quality of service requirements. The basic functioning is that data is cut into packets and which are routed through the internet using decentralized decision rules. And these packets cause congestion, which in turn causes losses and delays. And the big point is that users have to self-adapt to the congestion they create, and they regulate their output, the way they push data into the network, using algorithms such as TCP. So we are trying to understand better this feedback loop. And because of this feedback structure, we are expecting highly nonlinear behavior. Now, usually TCP is considered to be a so-called AIMD algorithm, additive increase, multiplicative decrease. And so the basic idea is that at each instant, each user allows himself only a certain number of packets in transit in the network. And this number of packets is given by an evolving window size, which the user increases gradually when it has the news of a successful transmission. This is the additive increase part, and decreases brutally when it has the sad news of a loss of a packet. And usually it cuts it in half. This is the multiplicative decrease part. So in this context, with this simplifying assumptions on TCP, what goes on for a single node is fairly well understood. And there are asymptotic formulae for throughput, etc. Even though many problems are open, depending on the level of precision one is seeking. In particular, there is a problem of delayed information. You know that the packet is lost only after a long delay, especially if the network is congested. So we won't take into account these kind of delayed information issues, but they are very important. Now, the problem is much less is understood about the real issue, which is stochastic networks, the topic of our conference, which I would define for this talk to be the coexistence and the interaction of varied data flows, which may be file transfers, video streaming, P2P, peer-to-peer, massively multimedia multiplayer role games. And these varied data flows have very different characteristics and use each in their own fashion a limited common resource, which is made out of varied nodes, such as links, routers, processors, files, buffers, and that have each its own purpose. So we are going to try to model that. Well, first, simplifying assumption, we are going to regroup data flows into a reasonable number of classes according to these characteristics, so we don't have to deal with the whole variety of things that can go on in a network. And so we focus on such interacting multi-class network models. Now, one approach which is very popular is to introduce an optimization problem into this, and it has been introduced and studied by several distinguished authors, some of whom I can see sitting here in the room. And well, there's a list of papers in which is not at all extensive. I've forgotten a lot of papers and a lot of authors on this subject. So this approach basically states an optimization problem that says that if there are xk routes of a certain class, of class k, well, they receive at the end a certain throughput which maximizes a certain utility function. Well, there are precise formula and precise forms for the utility functions which are given under various assumptions. And so in this approach, the utility function is summarizing in a very idealized way the global effect of TCP on the network. We forget about the description of TCP. We just say this is an optimizing algorithm that at the end results into this optimization problem. Now, so this is a very high-level macroscopic approach, and I I'm asking these authors, and I'm wondering whether it's akin to thermodynamical picture of the network. You have just one quantity, entropy, enthalpy, whatever, that you want to maximize, and that should give you what happens in the network. Now we are going to introduce a different approach, which is to first devise a macroscopic model, and then derive from this macroscopic model, from this microscopic model, a macroscopic limit. So we are going to work from the level of TCP and say idealize what users do and try to work out a global picture from that. So the idealization of TCP takes place at the microscopic level, at the level of the users. And then its effect on the macroscopic level for the whole network will be obtained by a limit procedure, which we'll try to, well, there may be different limit procedures taken. And so in some points of view, this is akin more to what is called kinetic models in statistical physics. It's a different level of description than thermodynamics. So now I'm going to explain the model we use, which is a Markovian model of user interaction. And we're going to introduce all the parameters that allow to try to describe what TCP does at a macroscopic level. So we give this Markovian model for a stochastic network. So we assume there are uppercase J nodes, which represent varied kinds of resources such as links, routers, whatever, buffers, and that there are uppercase K classes of users or connections, different point of view, but very similar. And there are n sub K users in class K. And so we define the vector of the class sizes, and we define the total number of users, which is just the sum of the number of users in each class. And this is going to, we're going to take the number of users in each class to go to infinity. Well, I'm anticipating on the limit. Now the idea of this model is that each user alternates between being either active or on, and that is when it has actual data to transmit, which means maybe he wants to access a web page or he wants to play WoW or something, and so he's on. And inactive or off, maybe when he's eating a sandwich between games, when it has no data to transmit. And then in this way, the user generates intermittent transmissions. When it's on, it's transmitting. When it's off, it's just resting there. So we want to model this kind of intermittent transmissions, not persistent transmissions necessarily. Now, each user, in a way that depends only on its class, when on, it emits through the network with an output which is dynamically self-managed using an algorithm such as TCP. And so the state, we'll call state of the user the way he regulates its output, which could be the window size, it could be the output itself. I imagine it as a window size. And when it's off, it does not emit. And then we just give it the state -1 because it's a very practical, isolated symmetry state, so that we can say that we can put everything in one framework. And so the state space of a user is this, is R plus union the symmetry space. So this is just simple modeling. Now we are going to explain how the flows impact the network. So we again assume that the node utilization by the active users is a function of their classes. We just say each class has the same way of impacting the network, given all other things being the same. So we describe this by an allocation matrix. So we imagine that this allocation matrix, so the term is AJK, and sometimes we use the transpose of this matrix, but we have to be careful. So the idea is that at node J, the throughput or utilization, occupancy, workload, whatever, induced by class user, which is in state W, which represents its output in the network, is, and so W could be -1 when the user is not active, and could be positive term if it's active. Well, it's just obtained by taking W, putting 0 if the user is inactive, and multiplying by this factor AJK. And so we just write it in short as AJK of W, the positive part of W. So this says that a user impacts, a class K user impact a node of type J proportionally to its output, and the proportionality factor is AJK. Now, the simplest example is just to put AJK to be 1 if node J is actually used by the class K user, and 0 otherwise. And this basically maps classes to routes. Not exactly, because you could have different arrival rates or whatever, but at least it maps classes to routes. And more general matrices allow to model effects such as different utilizations of the same node by different classes, and maybe things like packets of a given user taking different routes in the network. So in the first case, you would weigh AJK would be larger if a class impacts the nodes in a worse way, and in this case, you could separate between the different nodes that a certain route could take. A packet for a route could take maybe go through different nodes given the circumstances. So it's just a modeling issue to have a more general model. Now, if we logically then, we are interested in what happens at node J, and so we sum up, we have the total throughput of all users. If the nth user of class K is in state W sub nk, so we just take the positive part of the window sizes, we multiply them by this impact factor, we sum up over all the users in class K, we sum over all classes, and we obtain the way the node J is impacted by all users. And so the network congestion is described by this kind of weighted throughput vector, weighted because of the AJKs, which is, well, it's a vector which has a dimension, the number of nodes. And we can just note that in this model, it's just a linear function of the states of the transmissions, because we sum up, we assume this simple proportional impact of a user, of a class K user on a node. Now we're giving, we need coefficients now, so we are defining a lot of coefficients. And so for each class, the main point here is that for each class, there are coefficients indexed by the class. So these are basically rates. This is a probability law. I'm going to explain everything in the next transparencies. And so in class K, when the throughput vector is in state U, when the network congestion is in state U, then instantaneously, any off user is turned on at rate lambda k of u, which depends on the network utilization. So I'm going to explain why we could assume that we could have constants. And then it acquires a new state w because it was dormant, and now it's going to have a window and an output. And it's chosen using this probability measure, which could be, for instance, the direct measure at 0. And any on user in state w, which is then positive, is turned off at rate that depends on mu k, which depends on its own output and on the state of the network. And then when it's turned off, it acquires the new states -1, the symmetry point. Moreover, we have to explain what goes on when the user is active. The state of a non-user, when it's w, it drifts with a speed ak of wu, which is this is the additive part of the algorithm, and it jumps from w to rk times w. Rk was a constant which was which was less than 1, and we could take the general case is taking 1/2. And this jumps happen in reaction to losses, and at a certain rate which depends on the output and on the network state. Now there are special natural forms for the coefficients. For instance, if we assume that the output is proportional to the state, remember that it could have been a window size, for instance, then it's natural to assume that there are functions nu k and bk which depends only on the network state, such that this is the departure rate of the ending rate of users, and this is the loss rates of user. Then it's just proportional to w, their output, and then a constant which depends on the network state. So this is just saying that proportionally to the output, you're sending data proportionally to your output, and thus you're losing data proportionally to your output, and you're also finishing your transmission proportionally to your output. And the proportional factor depends on the network congestion. Now, if we simplify further the model, we could take this is the function that says when a user goes on, and this is the function that says when a user goes off. So if we have constant functions, then any class K user goes on at rate lambda K when it wakes up at rate lambda K, transmits an exponentially distributed amount of data with parameter nu K, and then goes off. This is the simplest case of on-off behavior. But I can say here, it's this, putting a U here, for instance, could model the fact that a user would balk at getting into a congested network. It would go in and just go out. So it's good to have a rate that depends on U, and having U here, this is the termination rate, would mean that the more the network is congested and the less work is actually done. So it's good to have some possibility of modeling complex issues, even though examples will take these simple assumptions of constant factors. And further, in many natural models, this is the drift rate. Well, the drift rate in many natural models depends only on the network congestion and is the inverse of the round trip time of a class K customer, which is given by a basic round trip time and then by a sum of terms that reflect the congestion at each node. And this is so the inverse of this would be a simplified version of the round trip time of a class K user. And this is, so BK of WU is, as I said, would be proportional to W, and beta K, which is the loss rate, would be also a basic loss rate and then a sum of loss rates impacted by the congestion at different nodes. And if we want to simplify these models, it's pretty logical to take these effects of congestions at the nodes to be linear, or at least for large uj to act at least linearly. The more the congestion, the more losses you have. So this is a quite well, it's in many models of TCP, this is the kind of assumptions that are made. Sometimes slightly different assumptions are made. So this would be simple set of coefficients, but we want to be able to model more complex things. And so in particular, we'll give assumptions which allow quadratic behavior of the loss rate, which is W times beta K of U. And in simple models, I say that beta K of U is linear in U. So you have quadratic behavior, and there's an issue of existence and uniqueness because it's not Lipschitz, it's locally Lipschitz. Now, so these parameters are general enough to address different modeling issues, such as I told you, bulking at arrival, and later if you get into a congested network, then you just go off, and this can be simplified into saying that lambda K is less, the arrival rate is less, the user just gets in and goes out. We could try to model things like fast start. This is why I took a measure sigma and not the direct mass for the window, the initial window size. We could kind of imagine that there is a jump in the window size because at first the algorithm acts differently than later. In a certain time scale, it's a different time scale at first. We can try to model freeloaders and parasites, etc., etc. So the idea is that it's general enough so we can have some modeling possibility, but we can go back to simple parameters if we want to understand what goes on. Now, this is a special case again. Yes, is there a question?
What's the difference between a freeloader and a parasite?
I really don't know, but maybe a freeloader is loading some. I mean, I like the term freeloader and parasite.
I just wondered if they were sort of technical terms.
I think it's good for an electoral campaign. You're fighting against freeloaders and parasites. It makes a lot more bulk. So a special case, which is very interesting, is the case of persistent transmissions. And if active users never become inactive, which means that their death rate, the mu k rate is 0, then the situation simplifies. We don't need a symmetry state. Users can be identified with their transmissions, which are persistent. And this is the model that was studied in a paper with Philippe Robert in Annals of Applied Probability, and further investigated with Mikey Verloop, in particular in NetGroup 2009. So this is the model without on-off users. Users are always there and are identified through their transmissions. Now we are going to, from this we get a Markov model which we will describe by Ito-Skorhod equations. So we define the Markov process quite naturally in denoting by W sub nk the state of the nth transmission of class K, and we have to look at the collection of all these states. And we choose to represent it by a certain Ito-Skorhod equation, which is awful, but the idea is that we use Poisson point processes, which we modulate by putting indicator functions. We could time change things and would be exactly the same thing. to describe the rates of arrivals, etc. And I don't want to go through these equations, but the main point is that they're coupled through this U, which is the state of the network. And U is, and I recall you that this is the way the network node J is impacted by all the flows that go through the network. So you sum up over all flows of a class, you put this factor AJK and you sum up over all classes. So this is, the coupling is through this term. So I won't go into the details, but the idea is that we have a need to score hard representation. And the following can be proved that the problem is well posed if we have standard assumptions. And there is pathwise existence and uniqueness for the stochastic differential equation, and the Markov process is well defined. But this is normal because we have rates which are not, which we can bound, and so it's rather easy to do. Now we are interested in the mean field asymptotic regime. And so this stochastic differential equation is a couple system in very high dimensions. And so we are going to perform an asymptotic study so that to render it tractable, which will reduce the dimension to the number of classes k. So this is the idea behind mean field multi-class model, is to get a system in low dimensions from a system in high dimension. So the idea is that we let the number of individuals in each class go to infinity in such a way that there is a limit proportion, pk, and if the proportion is nil, then the class disappears. So we want them to go to infinity in a controlled proportion. And we also have to scale the resources, the resource capacity. And so we put a factor 1 over the total number of customers inside the coefficient functions. And so, which means that basically we replace un by this mean version, u bar n, which is just the normalized version. But the idea is that we have scaled the capacities by the appropriate factor. And so we have this, we just rewrite the equation. And again, the equation, so it's not exactly the same equation since we multiplied the capacities by 1 over n, but then we have these u bars where there were u, and there is this interpretation of u bar, which is take the mean output in a class, multiply that by the fraction of the class with respect to the general population, take the impact factor AJK and sum everything, and then you have u bar, which appears here. So the idea, this system is in multi-class mean field interaction. Multi-class mean field interaction is not so common. Mean field interaction with identical, indistinguishable objects is very classical through this vector, through this vector here, and which means that actually what is important is the mean windows output of each class. So, a natural thing to look at is the empirical measure of the processes. And in particular, we can express the mean window size in one class at time t as being the integral of the function positive part with respect to the kth marginal. Well, this empirical measure taken at time t. So, so now we're in business, and we are going to first derive limit nonlinear Markov process and see how classes interact. So instead of having users interact, once we take the limit, we have class interaction. A user behaves not as an individual, but as a member of its class, and Marx is very happy about this limit process. So in the mean field asymptotic regime, the one I explained, under adequate assumptions for the initial condition, so we assume that the initial conditions converge in this mean field regime, basically. Then we expect a propagation of chaos phenomenon, which is what happens for the initial condition is propagated for the processes. And basically what we expect is that the processes, W and K, they should become independent at the limit, and each converge in law to a process, WK, which only depends on the class. And these are symmetrical picture. I mean, it's the same, it's almost the same statement. It's not quite the same statement though, but it's almost. The empirical measures which describe class K, these are random laws and path space, should converge in law and probability to the law, this is a law of large number result, to the law of the same process WK. And the limit process, W, which has only capital K coordinates, is a solution of the adequately started, because there was a condition on the initial data, following equation. So this is what it's called, either a nonlinear or a Makin-Blass of Ito-Skorha stochastic differential equation. And again, we only have, this time the number of equation is the number of classes, and the coupling between the coordinates is only given through this UWT. And UWT can be written as we were almost as before. Instead of having the empirical mean over one class, now we have the expected value of the positive part of the output of class K. Then it's weighted by the proportion, the limit proportion of class K in the network, by the AJK factor that says how it impacts the network, and then you sum over all classes. So, well, it's very specific, but as I say, so this repeated, the interaction is through the mean throughput vector, and this is a linear functional of the mean class output vector, which is the expected value of the positive part of the window size of the output, which can be written as a certain function of the law at time t, of the value at time t of the process. So this gets into a framework which is pretty well known, which is, and so in particular it's a Markov process, but its infinitesimal generator depends at time t on the law of WT itself, and not only on the value of WT. And so you're trying to find a law for a process, for a Markov process, so that the law itself of the process is in the generator. So this is a kind of a fixed point problem. And so in particular, if you write down the Kolmogorov equations, they are nonlinear integral differential equations. Instead of being linear, because of this feedback that the generator contains the law itself, then obviously, and the generator at time t contains the law of the instantaneous law, and so the Kolmogorov equations are nonlinear. There's one, because the generator depends on the solution itself, and we can associate it to it a nonlinear martingale problem, and this is why it's very often called a nonlinear Markov process. This makes more sense than a nonlinear stochastic differential equation, but the terminology has carried on to stochastic differential equations for people in certain contexts. So, so using this stochastic differential equation representation and adapting work of Alan Sol-Snitman, fundamental work in the early 80s, and there is a Saint-Flour course in 1989. I think in the late 70s, he did a lot of beautiful work on the Boltzmann equation and on different Vlasov models, and he really trumped quite a few analysts on what he was able to prove using probabilistic techniques. And so we can adapt his techniques. It's a little bit difficult to adapt them because we have to adapt it in a multi-class setting. And basically contraction techniques, first of all, yield existence and uniqueness for the fixed point problem related to this nonlinear Markov process. And these contraction techniques can be extended using well-thought couplings to prove mean field convergence. And this approach was used successfully in the paper I wrote with Philippe. But this paper was for persistent transmission, and now we have extended it to the general case of on-off users with intermittent transmissions, which adds more problems. But it's basically the same ideas. Now, there were many difficulties. One difficulty was the lack of symmetry of multi-class systems with respect to exchangeable ones, which are the ones that are usually studied in this kind of mean field approaches. In particular, the symmetry is of order factorial of product of the factorial of the sizes of each classes, which is much less than the symmetry order of an exchangeable system, which would be the factorial of the total size of the process. And so it's a little bit difficult to make things work, and at least some techniques don't work. And rigorous results are rare in this multi-class framework. Very often in statistical mechanics books, you have people study the Boltzmann equation for one species, and then they just derive, and they show how to derive it from microscopic dynamics, and then they just say, well, now let's go to the interesting case of multi-species or multi-type, multi-class particles, and they just write down the equation, but they don't prove convergence, even in a heuristic way, because it's much more involved because of multi-class setting. There was a technical problem because of the quadratic behavior of this is basically the loss rate, the way packets are lost, because it's proportional to W, the size of the output, and to U, which is, and usually in a linear way, and U is a linear function of W, so there's a quadratic effect here. And also in this, the introduction of on-off users introduces new discontinuities, and we have to make smart choices to get rid of them. And in particular, the fact that -1 has been chosen for symmetry state has not helped us a lot. And well, I mean, we have to do the right things to make things work. It's not technically, there is no technical new ideas, but you have to work to make things function properly. And now the assumptions, notably on the initial condition, reflect this. In particular, they reflect the fact that we have to control the rates, and so we can't take too big initial conditions if we don't want this quadratic term to blow off. And so, but on the other hand, we can't take stringent initial assumptions, because what we would like to study is the long time behavior and the stationary behavior of the system. And what we ended up with was Gaussian moment assumptions on the initial conditions, which is, and we can show that these are reasonable. We can't say that if we wanted initial conditions that are uniformly bounded, that won't work, because in the long term, it won't stay bounded. So now I'm going to pass to another part of the talk. Now I'm going to study the fixed point and the invariant laws for the limit. I'm not saying, and the idea is that this is going to give some idea of what happens to the invariant laws for the finite processes, for the processes before the limit. But it's not saying, there is not proof there that it converges. We're just saying that now that we have a limit process, it is likely that the invariant laws for the limit are relevant to the, and close to the invariant laws for the original process. So we're going to study the limit invariant laws. Now recall that a solution has an infinitesimal generator at time t, which depends on the law of the process at time t itself. And so obviously when you're writing down fixed point problems for the, well, you're writing down invariant law equations, it becomes a nonlinear fixed point problem, and it's not, instead of being a linear fixed point problem. And so this is an important complication in studying the behavior of, first of all, of the process, and in particular of the invariant laws, and even just studying existence and uniqueness for the invariant laws, because of this nonlinearity, because the limit, the mean field limit, allowed us to reduce the size of our system to a huge size down to the number of classes. But the price to pay was that now it's a nonlinear system. So this is the bargain in mean field limits. You start with a huge system with linear equations. Often you have nice reasons that there exists a unique invariant law because of, you know, general theorem, general principles. But you can't make sense out of it. And so then you pass to the limit, so you have a simpler problem in low dimensions, but this problem, simpler as to the dimension, but this problem is nonlinear, so there are different complications that happen. Now, one important thing is that if you start the system from an invariant law, and hopefully if the invariant law is attractive, if you let the system go long enough, it will behave as if it were started from an invariant law. Then the expected values of the positive part of the outputs are constant, and hence this kind of impact on this is the occupancy, the impact on the network is constant, and then W, the process, behaves just like a homogeneous Markov process in equilibrium. So this means that the equilibrium study, the invariant laws simplify a lot of things, and if we were to prove convergence, it would be a much simpler picture than the picture of the transitory behavior because of this nonlinear feedback. So now, from now on, we concentrate on this case where users or connections emit persistently. The users are permanent and can be identified to their transmissions. This is the case that we studied. So this is the case that we studied first with Philippe and then with Maike. And so we got interesting results in our first paper, and in particular, we reduced the corresponding infinite dimensional fixed point problem for an invariant law to a finite dimensional problem related to this network congestion. So the problem is, I'll show it. And then a much more complete study was the subject of a common work with Philippe and Mike Everloop. Now we make simplifying assumptions. So we assume that this is the drift rate, the additive part does not depend on W, the output. We assume that the loss rate is proportional to the output, and then to a factor that depends only on the class and on the network state. And we assume natural assumptions of Lipschitz bound and, well, Lipschitz assumptions on the coordinate, on the functions. So these are standard assumptions. Now, and in particular, we wanted beta k not to be bounded because we want beta k to grow at least linearly. We expect beta k to grow linearly with the congestion, so we don't want bounded here. But I mean, so we have good assumptions, simplified but good assumptions. Then we can prove that the invariant laws for the nonlinear stochastic differential equation are in one-to-one relation with the solutions of the finite dimensional fixed point problem related to the congestion of the network. And well, it has this kind of expression, and the size is the number of the nodes in the network. And it's obviously related. You find the AJK and the PK, the fraction of users of class K, and the impact on node J. And then you have this square root relations with the good part and the bad part, the drift factor and the loss factor. And you have this function psi, which depends only on RK. This is the multiplicative factor that appears when there is a loss and you have to multiply the window size so that it becomes smaller. So usually it's 1/2. And there is a semi-explicit formula for this psi, which is given by this infinite product. And moreover, such a solution, U star, because it's a fixed point, corresponds to a product form invariant law. So we can go back from once we solve the finite dimensional problem, we can go back to the invariant laws. And it yields a product form invariant law, which is important. The idea is that nodes become, classes become independent. This is part of the theorem almost. And it has a density with a parameter, which is this kind of load factor. And the density has a semi-explicit form, again, with products. And interestingly, it has the appropriate decay for Gaussian moment conditions. So the assumptions we had to do on the initial laws, that they had Gaussian moment conditions, are consistent with this law we find. So that's nice. Now, I'm not saying this is explicit, but we can do numerical computations, etc. on this. But even better, there are formulae for the expected value, the first moment of this law, and so we can, if everything goes right, we can compute the limit equilibrium throughput for class K users, and this is given by lambda k, which is the expected value of the mean size of the window, and it's the integral of there must be a plus here and also here. We have to take positive parts. And it's given by a factor psi that only depends on the the RK factor of multiplication in the square root of the load. Well, this kind of square root of the load taken at the fixed point. And as I recall, that U star solves a fixed point problem, and so which can be written as h of U star equal to 0. So there is some kind of relationship with the optimization problem. Because when you solve this kind of optimization problem, the one with the utility function, under some conditions, the optimal solution could be put in the form of a certain gradient being vanishing. So there is some similarity between what goes on here and what goes on in the thermodynamic picture. Now, many questions become natural now. First of all, how many solutions for the fixed point problem, which is not linear, and so anything can happen? Now, there are two methods basically for proving existence and uniqueness of solutions for the fixed point problem: contraction methods and monotonicity methods. And so under some assumptions, we can prove that there is existence and uniqueness of the invariant law of the fixed point and then and thus of the invariant law. For certain topologies of the network, such as one node, several classes, linear network with cross traffic, tree structures, certain ring and torus structures, we have some results. So in order to get results, we have to assume simplifying things like we assume the AJK is just 1 or 0. This is a simple case where it's 1 if node J is used by a class K user and 0 otherwise. And also we assume that the loss rate is basically something that is proportional to the total utilization along the route. It depends on the sum of all the utilizations on all the nodes that are used by the well, this is 1 only if the node is used by the class K. So then we write simplified fixed point equation, and we make the natural assumption that beta of K, which is the loss rate, is strictly increasing. The more congested the network, the more losses there are, and thus the more multiplicative decreases of the windows there are. And then and we also assume that AK of U is a constant, just to get things very simple. And then, for instance, in the case of one node, several classes, this reduces to one equation, and it's easy to prove that there is a unique solution for the fixed point equation. It's a multi-dimensional equation, but it's one, well, it's easy to prove that there's uniqueness there. And we have formula, and we find that if everything is equal except the round trip times, if everything is equal between classes except that the round trip times, AK is the inverse of the round trip time, are different, then we see that the outputs are a factor, are in proportion of the square root of the round trip time, 1 over square root of the round trip time. Well, this is the kind of behavior that has been observed in simple models already. Now, this is another model in which we have results. It's there is one big route, and there are with cross traffic. So this could be a model of a run route. And if you want to simplify what happens in the network and you're interested in one single route, then you just say that the other people impacting this route are just cross traffic. And so this is a linear network with cross traffic. And this can be also proved to have a unique fixed point and thus a unique invariant law under those assumptions. And we can prove similar things for tree structures, which I don't define except by this nice picture, which I thank Philippe for. And for certain ring topologies, so this is a ring topology, it's more like a polygon where routes use 2 of the nodes and then depart, and then we have this kind of links between the nodes are linked by these kind of two-way cross traffic, 2-node cross traffic. And we can complexify it with some further cross traffic. And maybe we can put in a roundabout, a road that goes, a route that goes through all the nodes. So all these topologies, we can prove that under those simplifying assumptions, there's a unique invariant law. Now, a certain number of questions. First question, is uniqueness of the invariant law of the fixed point equation and thus of the invariant law always true if the function, this is the function that says, relates the loss rate to the congestion, is non-decreasing? Is it always true? Well, there exists examples when not, and there is an example in a wireless context, and I think there are other examples in which even such kind of algorithm can exhibit weird behavior. So then we can ask this question, are there metastability phenomena in these networks, since we don't have necessarily uniqueness of fixed point and of invariant laws? Well, this is known and has been known for a long time for some example of loss networks with alternate routing, for instance, work of Gibbons and all, and Mark Book. And it's been shown for some wireless networks and work of Antunes and all. So we could expect, but we haven't proved that there are metastability phenomena in these networks. Well, it's an interesting problem. Another problem, can we show oscillations for this kind of network, of model? Such possibility has been suggested by the literature and the internet and by simulation, and in particular cyclic behavior in congested network has been observed. And for instance, there is a nice mean field study for a single node in a single class using delay equations done by François Vacelli, David McDonald, and Julien Régnier. And it's interesting. But in our model, we don't use delay equations, so it's a different, well, the oscillations should be brought about by different reasons than in their model. And so now I think it's time for a conclusion, a quick conclusion. These questions were actually part of the conclusion. There are open problems in this field. So there are different representations of the interaction of flows. There is this representation that uses basically an instantaneous fluid picture and derives from it an optimization problem. And the data for such models is the utility function. And part of the problem is what is a good utility function? If you were to have a network model which is more macroscopically described, how to derive the utility function from this description. And lots of work have been done around this, and there are different certain forms of the utility functions which are good for certain behaviors because they scale well, and we have logarithmic utility function. Usually it's strictly concave, and it has so there are alpha utility functions, and a lot of work has been done on that. And here we have presented a model starting from microscopic dynamics, and at the end this yields a fixed point equation which is in terms of the microscopic coefficient. And the data for the model then is the equation coefficients, the microscopic models. And again, there is an issue of modeling and an issue of maybe identifying parameters from data or whatever that can be addressed in this setting. And it's interesting to see the relationship that it could be between these two levels. As I said before, I've got the idea that this is more like thermodynamics, and this is more like statistical mechanics. But some people will say that maybe it's not, but anyway. Now, work in progress with Philippe. It's we would like to advance to get a more advanced fixed point study for intermittent transmissions. We got a nice picture for different topologies for the persistent transmissions, but the intermittent transmissions are much more difficult to study. The fixed point equations are tougher, so we are working on that. A very nice problem would be to prove convergence of the invariant laws for the finite sized classes to the limit laws. And this is very difficult and technical, and would need probably further simplifying assumptions in particular, to show that things go to the limit quick enough. Basically, we need assumptions that there is quick convergence to the equilibrium, which could happen in such a setting. But the problem is this: if there is oscillation, so it's hopeless to prove anything. The only case we can hope to prove something at least reasonably quickly is when there is one unique invariant law. And we are studying a more dynamic setting in which transmissions, instead of being initiated by fixed users, arrive from the outside world and disappear after completion. There is a kind of a rain of transmissions coming on the network. And this entails, this is a different scaling. It's not the same scaling because you don't have fixed sizes. Well, for the finite, the finite model has unbounded classes, so it's a different scaling. And so now, thank you for your attention.
So you end up with a fixed point equation, but if you do the flow approach, you have an optimization problem. If you want to solve the optimization problem, you essentially have to solve a fixed point equation as well. And then often, since this optimization problem has some convexity properties,
yes,
you get uniqueness from the convexity. So did you try to find an optimization problem that corresponds to your fixed point equation? And then exploit convexity?
We have discussed it, but we haven't really gone down into the details. But the idea would be, this is these two slides that say that we're studying a fixed point problem and it's related to this optimization problem. We believe that's the way that's a connection between the two models. Yes, we haven't really studied it, and also it's obvious that here it's nice to have good properties on the utility function, and we want to have similar good properties on the fixed point equation. So yes, it's an interesting issue. Yes.
So, a variant of the same question, are there any, so that was like, as if the objective is to get positive results, but then what if, have you tried to find specific conditions on your coefficients in which you can just show that there's an incompatibility between the micro and macro?
No, we haven't. I mean,
would you guess that such conditions exist?
I don't know really, because it's interesting to look into that, but I mean, here, the idea is that here, because of the coefficients, we could get about any kind of fixed point problem. So the idea is that the coefficients have to answer nice properties such as something like this kind of behavior, that the impact of the occupancy is something like a sum around the route. So this is a natural assumption. This increasing assumptions is very important too. So I believe that adding reasonable assumptions should lead to a similar picture, but I don't know. Obviously, if you just let beta k behave anyway, you can have weird behavior of all kinds. So, yeah, open question.
I think there's the answer is yes. You can choose models for the coefficients of the microscopic model such that the kinetic model has oscillations. And if the kinetic model has oscillations, then it won't reach the macroscopic optimum.
And can the kinetic model have oscillations under reasonable looking, where you have the sort of monotonicity, for example, that you would expect?
That was one of the open questions, I think. Where is it? This kind of question, is uniqueness always true when it's not decreasing? So there are examples when not. So this is partial. I mean, it's not exactly the same context, but it's a similar example. So maybe, and the idea is, I don't know if there are oscillations in this model, but and then there is this kind of, but there is this word. But as I say here, there are delay equations, which is a different realm. So there can be other reasons.
Yeah, actually, there may be oscillations even in the case without delay in one dimension.
Mm-hmm.
If you mix the on-off structure and the reaction of TCP, in the case where you have synchronization,
Mm-hmm.
namely, it means that when you have a large population and when there is a loss event, then many flows, say a fair amount, a proportion of
Mm-hmm.
those which these flows lose. Then the interaction of TCP and the on-off structure may create oscillations
Mm-hmm.
due to the in-phasing or out-phasing of the flow.
So this is a good point. We have just started the fixed point study for the on-off structure, so we haven't gone into that point. But it's true that the on-off structure could bring in more oscillations by itself. So that's an important point. The on-off structure by itself could lead to oscillation, but the on-off structure, I believe, is not apparent. I mean, it's not in the thermodynamic model. It would be a way of saying that instead of having, you would just put away a fraction of customers, the ones that are inactive. I mean, it doesn't appear at this on-off structure appears at the microscopic level, and I believe it does not appear at the optimization problem level. So that would be it would be difficult to compare this model with an on-off structure to I believe, to the optimization problem approach. But it's true that the on-off structure should help oscillatory behavior.
Sergey has an announcement to make, but let's
Okay,
first
just
thank the
maybe-
speaker.